So what I'd prepared today is for us to look at the guiding questions from scientific literacy. And this comes off of our competency website. So you have access to these at any time appeals to you. And I wanted to think about ways in which scientific literacy does naturally pop up, or could, with a little bit of like poking, pop up in other courses. And something that I found this semester, so in my science classes, I like to do our first lab with the scientific method. And one of the things I ask them to do is reflect on, where have you used the scientific method before? And of course, a lot of responses are things like, in high school chemistry, we use the scientific method, and then they don't think much more on it. But I have some quotes from students this semester. These were passages from their responses. And here's one that says, I've used the scientific method before with lots of things, but particularly my art. So applying it to art was this particular student. Here's one about game design and thinking about, when experimenting with new design and testing for flaws. So I found it really encouraging that students were relating the scientific method elsewhere, even if it wasn't necessarily labeled as like, this is the scientific method. But I thought it would be, interesting for this to be something that people bring up as they do problem solving, right? Is to think about how much are we applying the scientific method for problem solving. So
the student who said they incorporated it into their art, did they articulate sort of the hows and the whys of that?
Yeah. One example is from my film photography. A lot of the process for developing film is experimentation, trying to find the sweet spot to get the right exposures. Aside from the scientific process behind the development, I use the scientific method for visual effects too. While I was working, I broke a jar and noticed how the light was shining through it as I picked it up. I wondered if placing broken glass on top of the photo paper would create interesting light refractions in the print. My hypothesis was that it could. I didn't know exactly what effect it would create. I started experimenting with different exposure times and placements. I analyzed my prints and concluded that broken glass does create interesting light refractions, but they're hard to replicate, making each print one of a kind. So this particular student just kind of went through what they had done.
So I'm wondering if you could describe how you define a scientific method for students, and if they come in with a preconceived notion of what the scientific method is that you need to sort of adjust or
yeah. So this assignment where they're writing these reflections is prior to me talking about it at all. I say, where have you seen it before, and what do you remember about it? So you'll see some of them write that they remember certain steps, or but it's pretty vague and it's pretty cookie cutter for the most part, aside from these students that start to think a little bit more abstractly of where else they have seen the scientific method. I introduced the scientific method in lab, and it's not observation, hypothesis. So mine's a little bit more circular and it has lots more lines drawing back to multiple places to show that the process isn't always linear and that it can be cyclical, and that different inputs would influence where their results are going to come from or change their results. And so we talk about it in lab, and then we walk through a fairly cookie cutter lab about the scientific method where they utilize the steps. It's, in nutrition and fitness, I use one where they look at how exercise impacts heart rate. So they know the answer. They show themselves that they know the answer. But then they start to think about what kinds of variables might have influenced that. Right? Is the student already stressed out? Is that going to, because they start to see that everyone has different heart rates to begin with. And they start to, what I like about it is they then create new hypotheses and start to kind of think about how they would test that. So we do that. And then they do a post lab where they watch a TED Talk called The Scientific Method is Crap. And it just kind of walks through how the way that we, have learned it in grade school is so linear and not very realistic for how it's applied in real life. So they watch that, and then they start to add some thoughts into their reflection of should we change the way that we teach it? Should there be variation that we need to do and help people understand?
the thing the students are getting out of the TED Talk, or the thing the TED Talk is spending, is it that the scientific method is crap, or is it the popular understanding of science is
popular
crap? Yeah, okay.
understanding. Yeah.
So do you kind of dig into that?
Methodology is bad. It's just that the methodology is more. It's more complex than. And yeah, it's a provocative title that gets them like kind of like, huh. This sounds fun. Like, I don't like my class. Let's watch this video that tells me everything we did was stupid. Like, obviously, the scientific process is still very valid, and talking about the different nuances and the different influences and the ways that we move the scientific method around to deal with new problems that pop up in the middle. Because, of course, if you notice something while you're running your experiment, you're probably not going to keep going. You're going to try to fix it before you continue on.
So how much of your approach is teaching science? How much of it is translating what science actually is for the students compared to what they think it is? The basically overly linear popular understandings.
Yeah, so I think even when we start to discuss this, even in some of the reflections, they start to note that, your process is going to change over time, and what you are like as you find new information that's informing your future discussions. And they also have been really interested in like, oh, but as I learn this new information, that might not match with what I've seen in the past. Like, how does that influence it? So I think they are getting a pretty good understanding of science with the scientific method. Like, how does science work? How does the scientific method inform future science and past science and all of that? So I've found it to be pretty helpful.
Could I ask you to describe the scientific method for those of us who are a little uncertain if we are operating at the level of your worst student?
I'm digging deep into my long-term memory right now.
Yeah. So I think if I were to describe the scientific method, rather than thinking of it as like this linear process, which is what we are often taught, right? You make an observation, then you make a hypothesis, and then you design an experiment, and you analyze your results, and you draw conclusions, and then you have an answer. It's really more of using the knowledge that is already there. So taking information, whether that's sensory observations or previous research, like what else exists out there as you see something that interests you. And then thinking about, strategically, how can we test this to figure out like whether we're right or not? Like, is that really what's going on? How do we know? So thinking about what we would do, how would we change an experiment? How would we design an experiment so that we're not going to have a lot of confounding factors? Because that's something that comes up a lot as well is, the classic experiments that students often do in like intro biology classes where they have to like grow a plant and they have to see like what they modify to see if it still grows or if it grows better or worse. And people are like, oh, I'm going to water with Gatorade, right? Like they come up with something, but there's always some sort of confounding variables that they need to consider. So really taking mindfulness of that. And then from there, like how do you analyze results? And honestly, in one course, we can't get through every step very thoroughly. So I do not do a lot of analysis type work in my classes because as a 100 level science class, it's hard to get into statistics at a high level. But I try to point out that these studies always do have some statistics run. We look at the methodology of it. We look at the results. We look at error bars. We look at all of that. And then finally, like drawing conclusions. Is there really enough evidence? What does the result from that particular experiment, your observation, your exposure, how does that relate to what other people found? And then what future questions do you have? What limitations are there from your experiment? So really trying to think broad picture of everything and really recognizing that just because you found an answer, that doesn't mean that that's the answer.
So in the guiding questions, it says, have I applied a valid and relevant scientific method? A versus B is interesting to me, especially, as somebody whose research is as far from scientific as what most scientists would see, right? Like ethnography, but we use some of the same steps. It's like,
Of course.
the weird thing happening over here, let's go talk to people about it, and then do kind of data analysis. So why A and not B? Like, what are you thinking of when you...
Because I don't see it as being the same steps in the same order every single time. Right? To me, like if I'm like, this is the method, it's like, here's a recipe, you're going to follow the steps in that order. If I say, here are your ingredients, make sure they're there. Yeah, they have to come up with something, and they might come up with different things and different strategies for how to put it together. Just like the method, right? You might apply things in different orders. You might make an observation midway through your results that then spews you into doing another test. So I don't like thinking of it as one method, and plus the different types of experiments that you do can vastly vary as well.
I think also there's some subjects that are considered scientific but are not amenable to experimentation, where it has to be observations, where you're gathering observations and you can't control.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, nutrition, which I'm teaching right now, right? It's so hard to control people for like a scientific study in people, right? And then you think about all those variables, like it's a mess.
How many people actually comply with an experiment?
Exactly.
Or evolution or paleontology, for example, where you cannot run controlled experiments. Well, you can do artificial selection, but that's about the extent of what you can do.
Or even in a lot of, theoretical physics and cosmology, so basically what you're trying to do in those is come up with models that fit what you can observe, and then hope that future technological innovations will allow you to observe more, and that it will fit the model. Yeah, so it's almost like the theory precedes some of the possible observations in, like in particle physics and stuff.
Yeah. Good point. What else do you all want to talk about?
Well, Mike, I'm going to hog this conversation about the project that Mike and I are working on, because it's really interesting what you said about the nonlinearity. And one of the things that Mike and I wanted to elevate in these classes was to dispel the notion of the great man vision of scientific discovery, and that science is very much a social enterprise, and it's very much a product of its place and time. Newton didn't think about gravity because an apple fell on his head. He was in this decades-long argument with other, mathematicians in the continent about. Right. And same with, Galileo, who leaned on previous.
Watson and Crick.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But and Einstein, just this genius Einstein came up with the theory of, special relativity out of nowhere. No, he didn't. He was working in a moment of history. He was going to conferences. He was corresponding and talking to people. So I think, the way that we're trying to construct these courses, and we also have to sort of bring in this idea of technology as well, which is a little different, would really dovetail nicely with what you're doing in the class.
I'm curious, kind of jumping off of that, when you are doing higher level training in the humanities and social sciences, you spend a lot of time reading the foundational theory and then deconstructing it, right? Or looking back at, old white men who decided they needed to discover primitive religion so that they could extrapolate and talk about, modern evolved people's religion and all the assumptions that go into that, so that you can decide what of Durkheim is useful and what isn't. How does that play into this? I know there's a bullet point on there about the cultural and political and economic context of science, but how do you get at that?
Yeah, I talk a lot about limits to our scientific knowledge, and it comes up a lot in nutrition in particular. I'm teaching that class right now, so I see it. But a lot of our early science studies are either done in populations that are vulnerable, or we have data for a lot of white men.
Yeah.
And so that doesn't fit all populations. And so when students start thinking about this, they ask those questions. They're like, but does this work for all individuals? Or like, why is this stat for men, but not, it's different for women? And they have these questions because it's there. So we talk a lot about like the limits of science, and we talk about, some of the influences that set our guidelines. So when we talk about like the dietary guidelines that are set, and we talk about the food pyramid and how the dietary guidelines over time have shifted, the number of food groups we had, what stakeholders pushed for different things to be on or not on the different, the sugar industry, the dairy industry is a big one, right? Like, so we talk about all of that and how it isn't just founded solely in like experimental science, but how much society and stakeholders and the government are all influenced by these different factors. And so I think that's something that, in classes that aren't science, we can bring that up, right? Of like, these are ways that society is influencing regulation and guidelines.
Thinking of what are the ways of knowing how do scientists define what is known and what is knowable? What can science not know?
I think that first class, the how does science know, really gets at the gap in between actual scientific knowing and then the popular sort of consumption of scientific knowledge. That because a lot of people think they know science, and the same way that a lot of people think they know culture, but they don't. What they know is the popular, digested, translated in some cases, and often translated not very well or thoroughly, versions of. And so getting beyond how do we know science and getting to deep into how science knows, I think is going to be valuable. I would even sort of go as far as say necessary for our students. And so getting your insider knowledge to, so we're not translating poorly too, when we're trying to come up with that class, is going to be absolutely vital.
You say you're not a scientist or whatever, but to have your expertise as somebody who's like studied deeply in a field and can, because of your other skill as an instructional designer, can sort of parse it apart about how you had to learn it.
I was going to say that you could probably also highlight the differences between like conclusions and scientific theories as well. I've found students struggle with that a little bit because to them, conclusion sounds more conclusive than a theory. And so I struggle with that one a lot in that lab. So, but I feel like that could potentially tie in there.
There's two things I heard here that I really like to highlight. I think one is what are the limits to scientific approaches, and you were talking about. I think I'd like to think of it as like science will define certain questions that are more answerable, relatively answerable, and then exclude as non-scientific other questions that are not as answerable. That's sort of one way of looking at it, in the sense that on the one, although scientific approaches have to remain skeptical, and you mentioned this in the sense that you always have to be open to the possibility, however slim, that evidence may show up in the future that may invalidate a particular theory, even if it's something that feels as solid as the law of gravity. For example, science gets to that level by defining that there are certain areas that are not subject to scientific explanation.
And we think about like solving big questions and big problems takes a lot of money, and like to get grant funding you have to show that you have enough evidence that you can answer that question. And so some of these larger questions that might seem outside of the scope of science, we just don't have the building blocks for that yet, or we need to scale it back, or it's too variable.
But there's also value judgments too about what kinds of questions are worth applying a particular method or a particular amount.
That gets back to what Robin was saying earlier about what gets funded and whose special interests are at stake. And
when you do funding, I wasn't even thinking at that level. I was just thinking it was like science believes that you should be looking for causation. It can be explained preferably numerically, because quantification is a big part of science. Numbers tend to feel more solid and more objective.
Important part of the evidence gathering is reproducibility. And so I think that's where the sort of quantitative seemingness aspect of it comes into play.
Absolutely.
But there's also a value judgment in, putting a high premium on replicability, which is really important in some questions. Like it's a right to have that judgment. And then in other cases, it's like, are we discarding knowledge that we simply don't have the capacity to produce?
What science does is it says that in order for something to be called scientific, it must be replicable or falsifiable in Popper's terms. And so that doesn't mean that other knowledge
Isn't worth
having. It just
you're
says
asking Neil deGrasse Tyson, in which case that's exactly what it means.
it's just saying it's not. We don't call it scientific.
Right. Yeah. Although, to flip the question a little bit, scientists also make judgments about what they believe they can investigate scientifically in that kind of like, we're going to rule out confounding method and approach. And like, if you look at the idea of like binary biological sex, for example, like this seems like something that you can, investigate chromosomes, investigate hormones and stuff like that. But like, there's an argument in gender studies that the entire idea that this is how it's supposed to work is culturally constructed and blocks people from seeing scientifically, like this is not in fact a binary. It is a whole range of things in which a binary is like the most common expression. So
I have cool papers for that. I actually use that in human biology, and like there's a short paper called Sex Redefined where they like show that true spectrum. And it when I was working in Alabama, that was a like mind-blowing thing for students. They were like, wow, there's actually like science that supports this movement. And here students are like, oh, cool. Like there's actually science to support this movement. So it was pretty cool.
I think the sort of Neil deGrasse Tyson-y kind of version that seems to be another sort of gap between how science actually thinks and the popular reception. I don't think the problem is necessarily that science puts itself on a pedestal. I think it's that people put science on a pedestal in a way that does science a disservice. It makes it simplistic and authoritative rather than theoretical and engaged and active and lived. That to me seems to be less about the scientific and more about the literacy part of the competence, if that makes sense. It's getting students to understand that you're thinking of science poorly because you're thinking of it as simplistic and right with some sort of capital R compared to something like folklore with a small f and meaning, but doing it by an entirely different set of rules. And that one set of rules being given prominence over another rather than being understood as situationally valuable or situationally not. It's a very different mindset. And I often find that being the ooh-ah moment in my classrooms here. Just last week in one of my classes, we're reading a book called Eating in Theory, which wherein the author, she's a philosopher, but she talks about the fact that scientific understandings of nutrition and biological sex both don't even accord with the popular consumption of nutrition and biological sex. Yeah, so this again seems to be that gap between what science really is, according to people who do it and live it and breathe it, and how people who don't do it and live it, breathe it, receive it.
Yeah, I think there's a pretty common misconception out there that science is so black and white. And I think it happens on both sides, right? People that are afraid of science and people that do science. There's a lot of like, well, scientifically says, or, it's wrong or it's right. It's very gray area. And I tell my students this too, if they want to find scientific evidence to support one way or another, they can find it. Like you can support either side. It's out there, but it's drawing those consensus conclusions and trying to see where, the scientific design is, like how were these experiments set up? Are they designed in a way that's going to lean one way or another? And I think people are sometimes either drawn to or afraid of that black and white.
It's so interesting when we start talking about relativism and we start talking about the gray and the ambiguity, and then why should we trust science at all? It's sort of like, you're over here. So how do you get at that ability to accept the ambiguity? Or some people will say, well, the nutritionist told me last year that my LDL meant this, and now they changed it, so they must be wrong. It's like, no, science is like self-correcting, so like, how do you get at that.
Yeah, again, I think my experience is in Alabama, where living there during the times of the COVID pandemic, right, early on, and like trying to reason with people. They're like, well, this ended up being wrong, and I'm like, well, yes, because we learned more things, we have more information it's now going to shape our answer a little bit, change how we once thought about it, but every time we give an answer, it's with the information that we have at the time. It's tricky.
This question of expertise is a really interesting one that I try to address. This paradox. On one hand, science is never 100% certain, as I was saying earlier. But on the other hand, they often are driven to present science to non-scientists as if it was 100%, because they want to persuade people to address climate change, stop smoking,
Get a vaccine.
just to give a couple of examples. And politically, the public perception of science as 100% correct has been used against scientists by its opponents.
Absolutely.
So it's sort of going at those extremes.
But I think this is true for a lot of different fields, right? As we gain more information, sometimes what we previously knew or preached changes, right?
But there's different, people expect that works of literature are going to be read in new ways.
Yeah, well, like economics.
People don't want to be told that scientific findings are going to be superseded by new findings, because science has a particular privileged claim to knowledge. When it's presented in the public sphere, it is given a higher level than
So
to be like folklorists or historians. And the areas where I think, and you even see scientists responding in kind. So talking about sort of understanding science as a social, a work of collective social human beings. That kind of study is often done by people like Bruno Latour, who are anthropologists. And they've greatly advanced our understanding of how science in the lab is developed and affected by, and I'd love to see some work like that show up.
This is interesting because we keep saying science, and we often keep saying science active verb, but science isn't a thing that does stuff. Science is a praxis by a bunch of human people who have their biases and their fallibilities and maybe, driven by exactly the sorts of things that we want science to be driven by. Or they could be like religious fundamentalists, just with a different paradigm, and often are, and that's one of the things that to me is really interesting about teaching scientific literacy is like, how do you address science as an important, valid thing, go get your COVID shot, while also addressing, science is an important thing that is, in aggregate, trends toward accuracy, but it's also done by people who may be extremely biased in the questions.
It's a tough question, and it's something that I've definitely encountered with family members, friends, where I have to explain these types of things, and it's tough. So that's what I like about it too, is like that focus on the literacy, right? And I think that's something that's really kind of beautiful here, where we don't have really a science program right now, but we do have students that we're trying to inform to be good citizens, and to to ask the questions, to think about where would I go to figure out the best information for this. How are people thinking about science? Like, what is really putting a scientist hat on, even if they don't want to identify as a scientist.
I'd love to ask about some of the another element of scientific literacy, based on one of the questions, like how do I determine if scientific claims made by others are credible and reliable? And what are some of the ways in which science courses teach that? And what level of expectation should we have for the mostly non-scientists that we're training? What are some of the tools and strategies that we should be teaching them that they can use as educated citizens but not scientists?
I think that's a really important one, because I know that students will Google a question, right? And they'll read whatever article pops up first, and usually it's like Healthline or something, and it doesn't mean it's totally wrong, but it also might not be completely right? So I try to lead them toward looking for the sources, like what's cited here. Is it more of these like summary articles, or do they have scientific literature somewhere that's cited? Again, not all scientific literature is correct. We know science is changing, but where is this source? Like, what is this source? Where is it getting its sources from? What year did they come from? Like, is this something that's dated in the 80s? Is that still relevant? Like, has new information come out since then? So I try to ask them questions about the sources and have them think about, who wrote this source? When was it published? Has it been cited much? What does it cite? And are there any red flags in what you're reading? Does it claim a miracle?
That must be so hard with nutrition. I'm just thinking, the other day I was talking to somebody on the phone and we were like, dark chocolate and red wine, good this week or like deadly this week? Because some of this stuff goes back and forth.
It does.
It's presented in a good, bad, not a, well, maybe don't eat 5 pounds of dark chocolate,
I will say that originally, I remember when this rubric was originally designed, that the thought was that students would have enough scientific knowledge to be able to discern between competing scientific claims in the same field. I think that's just too high a bar for what we're doing.
Absolutely. When I was teaching biology majors, even then, like maybe the seniors would have some idea of what they were looking at, but even then, like you really need graduate work to like be qualified to discern that, and even then it's hard, right? Like it's tough to look at all of that. But so what I aim instead is to think about like what kinds of questions should we ask, what types of things might influence this claim, versus like is it right or wrong, because it's too much to ask that of a non-major in a one-off or a two-off class.
Craig, you just mentioned information literacy, and when we're talking about science, we're talking about an epistemology or a set of epistemologies. They make knowledge, not information. And so is information literacy and knowledge literacy? But the idea of being literate about information, being literate about knowledge or knowledge making seem different to me. And that seems to me to be one of the important differences between InfoLit and scientific lit as our competencies.
Our foundation toolkits are responsible for information literacy, so it's more like what we would get at is how, sort of scientists and technologists communicate and how they evaluate information. And maybe an interesting topic would be how the popular press would interpret a scientific finding and extrapolate off of there to a clickbait headline or whatever.
You're talking about methodological literacy in a lot of ways there, not just how do I judge or read or consume this information, but like, why was it done this way? Like, how do I understand? Do I understand how it was done?
Yeah.
The challenge, though, is that we're not going to be I don't think even after I finished my postdoc, I was necessarily like high proficiency for like if I read a different paper, right? There's so many different methods in each paper. I'm not going to be an expert in all of them. I might be good at a handful of them, but it's going to be hard to make those judgment calls. So I do think that one in particular is a little bit like too high a reach for what we're getting at, and instead thinking about like what types of things influence making that decision, like and it does kind of come down to more of an information literacy type thing.
I will say one way around that, or one way it gets back to what I think Mike was asking about, and as you understand the knowledge-making processes of science, then you can be more attuned to whether scientists are using those knowledge that claims to be scientific is adhering to those processes. We talk about rhetorical strategies that scientists use. And actually in the revision of this rubric, the most recent revision, we took the rhetorical strategies and moved it from the proficient level to the exemplary level. Because we'd love for students to get to that level, but it is also a pretty high bar.
Very high bar for a two-course.
For a two-course sequence,
Oh, yeah. It's a high bar for a degree, right? Like
in grad school, that's a big part of what you're learning.
Yes.
The rhetorical strategies.
Mm-hmm.